We're going to be listening to Filthy Words from George Carlin's record, Occupation Fool.
I was thinking about the curse words and the swear words, the cuss words, and words you can't say or you're not supposed to say all the time. Because words, people are into words. They want to hear your words. Some guys like to record your words and sell them back to you if you can. Listen in on your telephone. Write down what words you say. A guy who used to be in Washington knew that his phone was tapped. He used to answer, "Talk Hoover." Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. You can either take it out or you can start it over, whatever you want.
Well, one of our problems is, you know how...
Concerns the playing of one of my records on a listener-sponsored radio station in Long Island. Pacifica Foundation has a station, WBAI. They played a cut from an album. The cut is called Filthy Words. And it's a follow-up to an earlier album piece I did called The 7 Words You Can Never Say on Television. And as part of my routines, I developed this subject over a period of years, recorded it, and therefore it was available to radio stations. WBAI played it in the context of a program they were doing in the mid-afternoon about contemporary language and attitudes toward language. And else really has the right to keep them from doing that. The FCC took issue with WBAI based on a complaint by a listener who was in his automobile at the time and whose son was with him. And he claimed that it was indecent language. The FCC termed it indecent. Claimed that it was an invasion of his privacy and that his son shouldn't be subjected to that. Well, the FCC issued an order, not in this specific case particularly, but in general, that these words were indecent and could not be played. They left a few doors open as to how old a child is, I think, and what time of night they're supposed to be in bed, maybe. But at any rate, the FCC, they challenged the FCC, WBAI did, and they won in the circuit, D.C. Circuit Appeals Court, a 2-to-1 decision in favor of the radio station. Now the FCC is taking it to the Supreme Court.
How can you defend the use of words like this on broadcasting stations?
Well, you don't have to defend them, I don't think. They are protected by the First Amendment, by free speech, just as in newspapers and books and in films. The broadcast media should be no different. Now, of course, they weren't invented at the time the Constitution was framed, but there have been cases which have protected the use of these words on the broadcast media as well. My defense would be that, again, there are 2 knobs on these sets, radios. One is volume, and it also goes all the way down to off. Person can choose not to listen. Person can change the station if they don't like it.
Mm-hmm. But a lot of people don't know. They're searching, and they hear a station that sounds kind of interesting. And
used in vivid sexual context is another thing. If you're listening to some passage that appeals to the prurient interest and whose intent it is to arouse people, that's another question, and that's a whole different set of laws as far as I know. But term 2, indecent is what the FCC said. And offensive, yes, some. I don't know about large segment. I'd say that there's a good-sized segment that would. I think that American standards have come to the point where there's a large segment that would argue in favor of the free use of these words. Again, without the intent to arouse or the intent to defame. You know, they're just being used as these words. I would further make the argument later that you could use them in other contexts, but that's not what the case is about.
But sometimes if you hear the words on the street or you see them on a subway, that's one thing. But to hear them on the radio in the privacy of your own home and your own car, isn't that a little different?
It's different, but I don't know that it isn't protected by the First Amendment. The question is, can the Federal Communications Commission, which is an appointive body, and there are 7 members, I believe, can they abridge freedom of speech? Even though it's electronic, it doesn't change it. How do they get the power to do that? I don't think that in the Communications Act, Congress gave them the right to contravene the Constitution. I don't think it's in the writing of the Communications Act, and I don't think it's implied. And that's what the case is about. The district court, the appeals court, which ruled on it 2-to-1, the 2 majority opinions were different. One was based on statute, and the other was based on pure constitutionality. And I assume that's what the Supreme Court will rule on.
Do you think there is such a thing? I can appreciate Justice Rehnquist all the way down the line. I find and it must be me.
So who we got? We've got Thurgood.
You have Thurgood, yes.
We have Blackmun.
you have Powell. I don't know about Blackman.
No.
I would. Your lawyers would know better than I would. This is not Bob. Cool. Do you think there's such a thing as words that are indecent per se or obscene per se?
No, because I think the intent is always the test. If we were to decide tomorrow that a word we would make up would be indecent, we couldn't do that because it isn't indecent. These words are only indecent because, or offensive rather, because over a long period of time, the attitudes of people...
And the Teen Angel! The fantabulous Laugh Olympics will continue later.
But it certainly would be nicer if the children were not bombarded quite so much with TV advertising, because then they in turn bombard you. And it makes your day a little bit more hectic. There's more of a hassle. And sometimes there isn't even the time to stop and think, well, is this a good product or isn't it? You just react in a gut way. Darn it, if it's advertised on TV, I'm not going to buy it because I'm so sick and tired of having this situation occur.
Except for those things that one could determine were very seriously detrimental to health or had an influence on a population which was totally undesirable. I think then that we should not ban ads and we should not regulate their content.
Captain, then Orville. Come on, Teen Angels, let's check out Jordan's room.
You can have fun keeping on the run with an axe. Barbie fashion face.
Barbie and Julius and Sparkling Cat. Man, they're here! Barbie, you're beautiful! Yeah!
Barbie fashion face.
Superstar Barbie Fashion Face comes with brush, comb, makeup, and all the jewelry you see.
Rolo, chewy caramel, surrounded by real milk chocolate. Delicious, and you get lots.
Guess what?
You got them on your birthday. Maybe I'll have time to take you if this is Here's your presents. Well, the next presents are going to come.
In this period, I'm the acting manager, but assistant manager. I'm sure the manager would prefer that I bill myself as assistant manager.
Okay, all right. Just answer the questions any way you feel comfortable. Through it, we'll do it over again, we'll do it over again. These words are really filthy. How can you use these words on the air?
Well, filth is in the mind of the hearer. Perhaps to you they're filthy, but the fact of the matter is that in the 9 words that can't be said on television are listed in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
In Shakespeare. This is, as a matter of fact, the only thing I've come prepared with is a list of some authors, including Chaucer, Lord Byron, Ernest Hemingway, Thomas Hobbes, Richard Nixon, Dylan Thomas, and the list goes on and on and on. And those works would not be permitted on the airwaves in this country.
What do you see as the central issue in this case?
The central issue, as far as I see it, is whether or not the federal government, in this case the Federal Communications Commission, has the right to censor the broadcast media. And in fact, in the 1934 FCC regulations, they're strictly prohibited from censoring the media.
But isn't it in the public interest to keep words like this off the air?
How do you define the public interest?
Well, these words offend people. Don't you agree that a large segment of your audience might be offended if they inadvertently should tune to your station and hear words like this?
Well, as I say, each person is offended by what offends each person. Now, if these words were used in a gratuitous sense, I could certainly see a case for, quote, good taste having been stepped over. But in this case, in the case of the Carlin monologue, most certainly the words were not used gratuitously. They were used to illustrate the point. The point is freedom of speech. And in terms of these other works and authors that I've listed, certainly one could hardly term those a gratuitous use of offensive words.
But is it your position that a broadcaster may use any words he wants to on the air?
It's my position that the Federal Communications Commission has not the right to censor individual broadcasters. In the 34 communications guidelines, this was left to the broadcasters themselves. And I feel that once the federal bureaucracy begins to encroach upon the freedom of broadcasters, which is also the freedom of listeners and viewers, then they have stepped over the boundaries. I'm not arguing here for the use of words per se. I'm arguing for the freedom of broadcasters, of viewers, and of listeners.
Are you saying then that even if the words shouldn't be aired, even if the words are to a large segment of the community might be offensive, the decision on whether to air them rests with the broadcaster, not with the FCC?
Right. The FCC licenses broadcasters, and in their licensing procedures, if they do license a radio station or a television station, they obviously feel that the responsibility should be in the hands of those they license. And I believe that too. People have the freedom to tune in and tune out in terms of radio and television. And certainly they should exercise that freedom just as broadcasters should exercise their right to freedom of speech.
Do you feel that broadcasters have an obligation to operate in the public interest?
Certainly.
Do you think it's in the public interest to use words like these, words commonly regarded as obscenities, on the air?
Do you think it's in the public interest to run the same 7 rock and roll songs 24 hours a day?
What's the connection?
The connection is the public interest. You ask me if it's in the public interest. I can turn that question around and say, is a whole range of things in the public interest? Every radio and TV station is licensed to broadcast in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. And so if you ask me what is in the public interest, I'll turn that around and run through the schedule of your television station or any number of radio stations and ask you if that's in the public interest.
Well, maybe it's not. Maybe that should be changed as well. But if this is not in the public interest, how can it be justified? How can it be allowed?
Do you believe that the words of great authors are not in the public interest?
Well, they could be. They might not be. But what you're saying
You've answered your own question. They could be, they may not be.
But what you seem to be saying is that a station has a right to run these words even if they're not in the public interest.
What you seem to be is totally hung up on these words and not on the concept of this case. And the concept of freedom of speech, something you seem to be very hung up about before the camera went on, but no longer are.
Okay, you can cut. I play devil's advocate.
I see. The second you walked in downstairs and said you want to broadcast, I knew you were going to play the devil's advocate.